Apologies. We have apologies for the chairperson, Philip Brett. And have we any other apologies?
From Source Eastwood.
Source Eastwood. Okay. Members' declarations of interest. If any members have any declarations of interest relevant to today's minutes, please let us know, or let us know at a relevant point within the committee meeting. Chairperson's business. The members had agreed that the chairperson would meet informally with the permanent secretary. He did so yesterday, and the clerk has circulated a note of that meeting to members. The minutes, draft minutes, I refer to page 7 in the meeting packs. There's draft minutes from the meeting of the 1st of May. If members who were in attendance are content that the draft minutes are accurate and complete record of the committee's deliberations at its last meeting, could you signal agreement, please?
Agreed.
Okay. Matters arising. Does anybody have any matters arising from those minutes? No. Okay. Members, just to highlight as well, obviously we've made aware that the Minister for the Economy is unwell, so obviously from a committee perspective we want to pass on our best wishes and regards and well wishes to the Minister for the Economy, and hopefully he has a speedy recovery. So members, the committee will now receive an oral and written briefing from representatives of the system operator for Northern Ireland, SONI, on the challenges for the electricity grid and meeting the net zero climate change targets. I refer members to the briefing paper at page 31, an extract from SONI Generation Capacity Statement at page 50. The Utility Regulators paper on SONI's Transmission Development Plan is at page 66, and previous correspondence on renewable energy project planning delays on page 167. So can I formally welcome Alan Campbell, the Chief Executive of SONI, and Gareth Brown, Head of Communications and Engagement at SONI. You're both very welcome here to the committee. I think what we're going to do first of all is obviously hear from yourselves, maybe just a short opening statement, and then we're going to open up then to ourselves as members for some questions. So over to yourselves.
Thanks very much everyone, and I appreciate the opportunity to give you a briefing this morning. SONI is the system operator for Northern Ireland. We operate the high voltage transmission network across Northern Ireland, and we also, in conjunction with EirGrid, the system operator in the south of Ireland, we operate the single electricity market, the all-island single electricity market. As well as operating the system on a 24/7 basis, we also plan the long-term future of the network across Northern Ireland, which is particularly important now at this stage as we look to bring forward to meet the renewable energy targets. It's important to note that SONI, we're an independent system operator. We're licensed by the utility regulator. We don't own the power stations or wind farms or the power lines and pylons that you would see about the countryside. So in that sense, we've no real vested interest in seeing new assets being built, other than for meeting the needs of Northern Ireland, both in the short term and the long term. Northern Ireland, it's probably fair to say that we're undergoing a once-in-a-generation change to the electricity grid and this actual system. The grid was largely built in the 1950s and 60s, when we had 3 or 4 large power stations, in the kind of close to the major urban centres of Northern Ireland. But we're moving now to a much more decentralised energy system, where we have wind farms, solar farms, batteries, and power stations in much more diverse areas of Northern Ireland. And we're also looking at potential for offshore wind farms, also looking to connect to Northern Ireland, as well as more interconnection to other parts of GB and the Republic of Ireland. Policy ambition, as you'll be very well aware, has shifted quite quickly. So we had a 40% target for 2020, which is achieved a year early. In 2021, the executive signed off the energy strategy with a 70% target by 2030, and that was increased a year later to 80%. So we're currently operating the grid probably on average with around about 45 to 50% of renewable electricity supply and demand across Northern Ireland. A move to 80%, it's hugely challenging, it's complex, but the good thing to know is we have a plan in place in terms of a roadmap of how we could move the system forward, both in terms of the grid infrastructure that's needed, but also how we operate the grid itself, and also the markets that actually support and underpin the successful operation of the grid. We published what we call Shaping Our Electricity Future, which is our roadmap across all those dimensions that I've talked around as to how we can get there to an 80% target. As I mentioned, it is a complex and challenging process. The electricity industry, it's highly complex. There's hundreds of stakeholders involved, so there's always a balance to be found and struck between what we have to do to operate the grid on a secure basis, but also look at the cost of that to consumers, and as well managing that security of supply, which is vitally important for the economy. So we're always looking to find balanced solutions in terms of what we're doing. In 2021, I'm kind of just talking around where we're actually at now in terms of that journey to an 80% target. In 2021, we increased the amount of renewable electricity that can actually be connected to the grid at any one point in time to 75%, which is world leading in terms of, particularly when you look at a small island area, which is because we operate the grid as one synchronous area with the Republic of Ireland. So it's actually world leading, and we're actually doing well, but there's a lot to do now to actually move forward and make it an 80% target realisable. We're working very closely with NIE Networks to bring forward a number of grid upgrades, and we've already handed over a number of projects to NIE, and we have a number of other projects that are in the what we call the pre-construction phase, or the phase of the project where we have to determine what's the best technology to build, where it has to be built, and then bring it through the planning system to get consent to build that infrastructure before we hand it over to NIE Networks to construct it. So there's a number of projects underway in that space. We're also looking forward to managing that power system with much more intermittent, weather-dependent source of generation. So it's much more complex now than when previously we were able to phone up the power stations and ask them to generate more or generate less depending on the consumer's demand. So now we're moving the system, which is we want to try and achieve as much from renewable generation as possible and balance that with the amount of conventional type of generation. So in saying that, there's some short-term challenges which we need to manage. But the good thing is Northern Ireland isn't alone in terms of how we're managing these. Across the globe, everyone is looking to decarbonise. So we're dealing with the same challenges, and we have good contacts with peer organisations across Europe and across the globe as well to see what they're doing. It's also important to note just that we're working as well as building grid infrastructure. We're working on operational solutions as well to be able to increase the amount of renewables connected. I think it's fair to say that it's not just as simple as making sure that there's enough power being generated at any one point in time. We have to, as well as manage the amount of power being generated, we also have to manage the quality of that power to make sure that homes, businesses, farms are all receiving the power of the right qualities, or else it will cause difficulties and damage to equipment. So it's really important that it's not just about the amount of power, it's that it's the right quality. So that's why we have to employ certain systems to the grid to actually make sure we've got the services that we need to actually do that. We're also looking as well at bringing on future different types of low carbon inertia services, and that will help us increase again the amount of renewables connected at one point in time. Battery energy storage schemes are important, as well as long duration energy storage. These are other very important factors that we need to see innovation in the sector, and we're starting to see that happen again locally, but across the globe as well. So there are solutions out there. Smart metering is also going to be key as we move forward. So it's not just about I say the amount of power we can produce. It's about balancing the demand, and if the peak demand we expect could well increase as people start to decarbonise their heating at home, as people start to increase the uptake of electric vehicles across both from a domestic perspective but also industry. So smart meterings with the right incentives for consumers will help us balance that so that we can put downward pressure on the peak of electricity demand, and that way we minimise the investment that consumers have to make in terms of backup power generation. We have an extensive programme of grid infrastructure that we plan to bring forward. We've got 6 key projects outlined in our 10-year transmission development plan. The North-South Interconnector, the Mid-Antrim upgrade, the Mid-Tyrone project, and a project which we call Energising Belfast. These are all essential to decarbonise Northern Ireland's power system and make sure the grid's robust for increased amounts of renewables or increased amounts of decarbonisation of heat and transport. I think it's fair to say the North-South Interconnector, I know it's been a long time in the planning process, but it is vitally important, both in terms of Northern Ireland security supply, but also to unlock the sharing of renewables between Northern Ireland and the south of Ireland and bring on more of that renewable generation. So we're looking forward to that progressing further, and we're actively engaging with our colleagues in EirGrid, but also NI Networks and ESB Networks to get that project brought forward. We do realise that new infrastructure can be challenging for local communities, and this is an area that we've seen both in our past projects and we expect in future projects. So I think it's really important that consumers are brought on the journey, landowners and communities are also brought on the journey as to the benefits of these projects for wider society, and it's something we would be keen to be involved in further. Or we do have an extensive community engagement process as part of our projects that we bring forward. So we are actively engaging with consumers at the very early stages of our projects before any lines are drawn on maps, so that people can have their say in terms of what projects were being brought forward and how it impacts their local areas. But certainly we recognise that more could be done in that space, and we're committed to make sure we do our best in that area. So I guess that sets some of the things we're doing at Sony. We're also looking at our own processes to see how we can really accelerate and bring forward these projects quicker. We know what needs to be done to meet the targets, so we're actively looking at what we can do ourselves, and we're making changes in terms of our own processes to get these projects through quicker. But at the same time, we can't compromise on our community engagement, and we also always need to balance that cost to consumers. In terms of outside of what Sony's doing, there's certain barriers we need to see removed in terms of these projects being brought forward. We also need to look at the opportunities that are to bring forward progress quicker. We know that some of our projects can get stuck in the planning system for multiple years. So whilst we're really committed to the planning process and community engagement, we do need to see the planning system work into tight timelines, where possible give priority to renewable projects. The main thing is that the statutory consultees are adequately resourced to deal with the consultations out there in a really timely fashion, so we can bring these projects forward as quickly as possible. Because they are multi-year projects, these will take a period of time. We're also looking at making more strategic investment decisions earlier in time, so that means an element of risk. That's an element of risk that consumers would potentially bear the cost of, but we're putting in place robust systems that will actually manage that risk, so that we're making proportionate, anticipatory type investment ahead of time. But we would need support from the likes of the utility regulator and other key stakeholders in doing that. Landowner compensation and community benefits, something that again we'd like to do more in the space of, and we're actively engaging with the utility regulator in that area. And as well on systems, the market needs to change to actually really remunerate the kind of backup generation, backup services that we need to support a transition to more renewables. It's been well talked about, the remit of the regulator, and I'm aware they're speaking to you later today as well. We're keen to see that that's brought through as quickly as possible. Again, that would unlock more of this investment that's needed, to move things forward in terms of decarbonisation. As I mentioned, the people are at the heart of all of this. Us as consumers, we all use electricity. Everyone that we work with, they need to be brought along in terms and educated as to the benefits of and the opportunities as to moving forward in terms of reducing the amount of imported fossil fuels that we're using to power our electricity supplies, and also cleaner air and environment that we can realise. So just disclose, Sony's really up for the challenge. We do recognise it's a tough challenge. Time is of the essence, but we have a plan in terms of what we can do, and we're here to work with all stakeholders and colleagues to make that happen. So look, thanks very much. Happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Alan. Obviously, we have a number of questions here from members. If I just kick off just in terms of, obviously there have been concerns in the past around, governance structures, EirGrid, the relationship. Obviously, in 2022, the utility regulator, sought to modify your licence, obviously to address some of the practice or to emphasise good practice in corporate governance. Could you talk through to us in terms of that governance piece, how you operate, manage, sort of independently from EirGrid? Obviously, you're owned by them, but how do you have that sort of independence? And give us some reassurance to that front as well. Have you implemented any changes from that time?
Yeah, of course. The licence changes were implemented, as you say, back in late 2021, early 2022. Can't remember the exact date, apologies. But yes, so we've appointed a new independent board. They started in October 2023. So they've been in place now just over 6-7 months. So we've now implemented that first phase of the new governance arrangements. We've also implemented new organisation structure in Sony, so we now have, whilst there were all previously local management in Sony, we're increasing that. So essentially we're going about implementing the utility regulator's licence requirements, and that's had a date of December 2024 for full implementation of that separation. and we're working on that journey to implement that. So steered by the new Sony board.
Okay, and do you see December 2024 as achievable to implement those?
We were slightly behind in terms of making the board appointments, so that has a bit of a knock-on impact. But we have transition arrangements in place, separate governance in terms of how decisions are made in Sony to ensure that Northern Ireland consumers are at the heart of that. As I say, we've implemented an interim management structure in Sony, and we're going about that. I think it's fair to say we operate as an integrated group with EirGrid in lots of areas, whilst there were some separate areas still with local management in Belfast. But we're now looking at increasing the capabilities directly within Sony, because previously some teams were shared across the two TSOs, the two transmission system operators. So there's some loss of synergies in terms of what we're doing. So it is a long-term journey. So some of the people that we have are, the skills are highly sought after and hard to source. So there's a journey to go on, but we're committed to implementing the license requirements in full.
I think if I would just add to that, we've enjoyed a really close working relationship with the regulator in implementing changes to our licence. So we've been working very closely with John and his team on that journey. And I think we share the utility regulator's vision of a world-class TSO working for people in Northern Ireland, and we've been working through what that means. Obviously, it's an enormous change, and internal changes of that magnitude take a degree of time to do, but we're working very closely and getting on with that. I think it's important as well, and it's recognised by everybody, that given that change, it's important that Sony's also resourced properly to provide that functionality and capability here in Northern Ireland, in areas where we would have shared those services with EirGrid before. But again, it's something we're working very closely with the UR on.
Okay, thank you. Mike?
Chair, thank you very much. Good morning, gentlemen. I appreciate your engagement with the committee. Two areas for me. The first is about interconnectors. So on the 24th of April, some of us were at an event in this building when we heard news of plans for a second interconnector with Scotland. What I tried to understand was, what is the nature of the competition between the new one and the existing one? And frankly, I didn't get, David was part of the conversation, didn't get satisfaction. So what is, if you're buying electricity from GB, which connector will it come down?
I think so. It is quite a complex area, but essentially it's down to how efficient the interconnector itself is. So there's technical, how it's actually operated drives the efficiency of that interconnector, and that has a knock-on impact in terms of the cost. So, but really the market here in Ireland, it's an all-island single electricity market, sets a price for electricity. That's then compared to essentially the price that GB is offering to sell its electricity for. And whoever's the lower cost will import or will export power to the other market.
And down which interconnector?
The rate proportion just depends, again, as I say, on the efficiency of the interconnector as to how that will actually be determined.
Well,
there's a complex set of algorithms that are set up and designed to actually determine the market flows across the two interconnectors. So potentially, if the market conditions are right, both interconnectors could be importing or exporting at different levels.
Okay, so just for the sake of talk, let's say the electricity is being generated in Edinburgh and you're bringing it into Northern Ireland. Mm-hmm. Which of the two interconnectors will flow down? How does that efficiency be determined?
Well, it would largely depend on the actual volume. So if we wanted to import, for argument's sake, more than the actual capacity on one interconnector, then it will be split, and it will just depend on what the prices are at a particular moment in time.
Okay, but how do you choose which one to begin with?
I'm not an expert in terms of how that's set, and I'd be happy to kind of take that away and either I appreciate I think the committee are welcome to Sony later in September. We'd be happy to get the subject matter experts in the room to talk about that at the time.
Well, personally, I think it'd be really good to understand, because that's the second conversation that doesn't explain to me how the two interconnectors are going to interact. So the other area is tidal, because some industry experts have said to me tidal is too expensive to be economically viable, and yet the department recently said no, we are looking at tidal, and of course it's much more predictable than wind. And being an island, tidal could be a very important part of the mix. So, do you have any opinion on that?
Well, again, we don't own tidal assets. We previously had offered connections to connect a number of tidal generating stations up close to Rathbone Island at a point in time, but those projects didn't progress. The technology at that stage was in quite early development, but as that technology starts to get rolled out across the globe, we would expect those prices to come down and be more cost competitive.
Right. CGen was a success in Stratford Lough.
Yeah, and it was again relatively small scale in terms of the overall mix, but obviously it's renewable energy, which is welcome. But the technology in large scale is still being developed, brought across the globe. So it's not quite there at that commercial scale in terms of it being fully deployed and being cost competitive with the likes of offshore wind and onshore generation.
I think maybe just to add Mike, I suppose there's a wider policy question around interconnection more generally that I think it's important that the committee is aware of as well. And there is our license requires us or obligates us to offer a connection offer to anybody who wants to connect to the grid, including interconnectors. So we don't actually have a sort of say, as it were, on whether a technology is right or appropriate for the grid in Northern Ireland under the way that we currently plan and operate the system. But I suppose it's important to remember, as a system operator, we're generally very favourable towards interconnectors because they'll allow us to manage security supply in a more structured, systematic way as we move into a more renewables-based world. But it is also important to remember that interconnectors flow both ways. And what we've seen over the last couple of months in particular is, more imports into Northern Ireland at times when we have high levels of our own renewable generation. And it is a market that dictates those flows. Mm-hmm. So there's times when we're importing electricity into Northern Ireland when we could be using our own and we don't necessarily need it. So I think when forming a view about the value of interconnection, yes, they're very useful for us from a security supply point of view, but it is important to consider the wider impacts of what that can mean as well. And for good reasons, the systems in Great Britain because they're much larger in scale, the price of the electricity tends to be lower there. And so what we've been seeing over the last couple of months is that those import flows, which is compromising our ability to use some of our own generation here.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for coming in today. I suppose firstly, following on from the Chair, Deputy Chair's original question in relation to the governance structures with EirGrid, I suppose it's very difficult to get your head around, because how does a board operate independently from an organisation which owns it, and particularly when it comes to managing conflict? So I'd be very keen to hear how that works, in particular, that Northern Ireland's not the poor cousin when it comes to certain decision making which inevitably has conflict, Republic of Ireland, Northern Ireland.
So we have an independent board, so 4 independent non-executive members. I'm sitting on the Sony board as well, and we have one representative from EirGrid on the board. So those decisions, people declare their conflicts of interest as with any board, and decisions coming from that Sony board for decisions. And without going into detail, there are sometimes decisions that would put us in terms of conflict with the decisions that maybe EirGrid would be looking to make. But when we look at it from a Northern Ireland perspective, the board forms its own views and brings those forward.
So when it comes to managing the conflict in terms of if there is a decision that inevitably has an impact on either side of the border, how do you is it a straight numbers game and such, so therefore Northern Ireland loses every time, or how does that relationship be managed when we have a point of conflict?
So ultimately for matters that impact on both sides of the border, there is an all-island single electricity market committee. So if there's all-island matters that are to be decided on, typically the SEM committee would be making those decisions, and the 2 TSOs would implement those decisions. We have our own local management then in terms of the operation of the power grid in Northern Ireland, and we interface 24/7 with our colleagues in the EirGrid control room. So if there's decisions in terms of maybe turning on power plants in Northern Ireland, well, those decisions are made locally in terms of once the market rules have run their course. So if there's decisions that we have to make locally, they're taken in Belfast.
Are you content the changes that have been made satisfies the concern that there was in relation to operational independence from EirGrid?
I think it's fair to say that the utility regulator did a very thorough investigation in terms of that, and they didn't find any evidence of any harm. But nevertheless, Sony's going about the full implementation of the utility regulator's licence, and as Gareth was saying, we're working very closely with colleagues in the utility regulator and bringing both sides along the journey. So yes, we are fully implementing that, and from my perspective, we've always had good governance, but this is an added layer on top of that. So it's
okay. Security of supply is a major issue across the world, particularly recent events have really things have really got a lot worse in terms of the energy sector in general, but in terms of security of supply, particularly with electricity, your generation capacity statement highlights some of the challenges that Northern Ireland may face, and I'm just trying to quantify and get my head around about how serious a challenge it's going to be going forward. So probably to try to get my head around it, how close have we been in our recent past to mass blackouts in Northern Ireland in terms of electricity?
I don't think in my time, I don't recall any time where we've been anywhere close to that type of event. We would issue system alerts, which are whenever the buffer or the margin between the generation available to Sony and the demand for electricity is tighter than what we would like. So we always like a margin of reserved electricity there available to us, so we can turn it on quickly if an issue happens at another power station, for example. So we issued one alert in the winter just gone by. In the previous winter there were no alerts, and in the winter before that maybe 3 or 4. So that's only when the margin is tighter than what we would like. So it doesn't mean that there's an imminent blackout, and we have robust steps in place that if that margin was eroded to the point where it was too tight.
And how do you quantify the risk going forward? Do you foresee, if we continue in our current trajectory, blackouts, energy shortages?
No, so our generation capacity statement outlines, depending on the increase in demand that we see going forward versus the generation available to us, that there could be times where the margin is tighter than what we would like, but it's within the standard in terms of what's called the loss of load expectations, the standard set by the department in terms of how we can manage the grid. So it's a challenge that we need to manage. There's risks involved. If the generation that we have in Northern Ireland and indeed the Republic of Ireland is available to the grid operators, then there is sufficient margin there. But if there were unforeseen, large-scale unforeseen events, then there's always that risk. So no system operator can ever guarantee that there won't be a blackout. But we have good mitigation plans in place to deal with scenarios so that we can actually limit the impact.
I think, John, you're right to point to the fact it's a challenge facing all modern power systems going through the transition that we are as well, and there are some short-term challenges of managing a power system going through that transition. So I suppose a colleague of mine often sort of quips that it's like trying to fly a plane and rebuild it at the same time. So there are some short-term challenges into moving our system off those large conventional generators and on to more renewables. So things like timing of like the outages that the generators need to be able to make maintenance work, forced outages, obviously the wind and the sun not blowing or not shining are challenges that we have to manage with as well. But there are technologies coming down the pipeline in terms of long duration energy storage, perhaps the use of hydrogen, for example, that will help us manage security of supply in a renewables based system in due course. But I think your question also goes to the heart of one of the challenges of the electricity system is that it's quite complex. And there's an entire market and private sector that sits below us as the system operator. And I suppose we are relying on the market to produce the generation that Northern Ireland needs. We can signal and let it know how much we need, but we can't control whether or not that is actually delivered and delivered on time. So we're just having to manage the system with the generation that we have and try and send the right signals for the future to ensure that we have that.
So on the point of the North-South interconnector, which you touched on in your initial briefing, and Mike hinted on it as well, I would take fully on board what you've said in relation to community consultation. I think things have got better, but I think there was huge failings in the beginning, particularly on the North-South interconnector, having known some of those communities and the genuine concerns that they had. I think there was a lack of information and a lack of an ability to engage appropriately early on in the process, which is vital whenever delivering some of these large-scale projects. Are you in a position that you can outline the expected timeline for the completion of the 120 million North-South interconnector?
So we're at the phase now where we're looking to just finalise all the landowner consents for the project, and we should be then in a position to hand the project over to construction to the two network companies, ESB Networks and NI Networks, both sides of the border, for early next year. So we estimate it's a 3-year build-out plan for the North-South Interconnector, so that would take us into late 2027 for the construction completion. As I say, you make a very valid point around community and landowner engagement. We've really increased in the last 7-8 years the amount of consultation that we do as part of our projects. We've recently brought a number of projects successfully through the planning system, and were commended by local elected representatives in terms of the engagement we had with communities. We do realise these are difficult decisions that have to be made, but we're in a position where these assets are vital in terms of security supply, decarbonising, and making sure the market's as efficient as possible. So we have to get out there and engage. But we're totally committed to that.
And I think John, just to add what Alan said, we recognise if there are opportunities for us to learn and learn from perhaps times where we haven't got it right, and we're absolutely committed to doing that. I think going forward, it is really important to understand the scale of infrastructure that we have to build now to ensure that 2030 is delivered sufficiently on time. So you are talking about more overhead lines, more pylons across Northern Ireland, and so we recognise the importance of community engagement within that. I think from our perspective, it is important from a policy point of view to discuss opportunities to make that easier. So for example, Northern Ireland is now an outlier when it comes to a standardised package of compensation for landowners, similar to that in the Republic of Ireland and GB. From the network's point of view as well, we would also welcome a conversation about a community benefit model, again, that you see in Ireland, for example, to recognise the burden that local communities have in hosting this infrastructure. But I suppose we're in the position where we have to balance all of these competing priorities, as Alan said in his opening remarks. And a lot of local communities would like to see us underground, for example, a lot of infrastructure. There are some times where that is just technically not the right solution or not possible. And often it can be very, very substantially more expensive. And I suppose at the heart of this, we have to remember that consumers are ultimately paying for all of this. So I suppose we're in the position of having to try and find balanced solutions to all of this going forward, to deliver the requirements of all of these stakeholders.
And finally, from me, in relation to planning concerns, so delays in our planning system is something that every member in this committee is well aware of. You mentioned about 45 to 50% renewables on the grid. To reach our target, the delays in planning is hugely concerning to anybody that's in the industry. Recently we had a debate in the Assembly Chamber where we talked about PSC hearings for large-scale renewable projects actually taking in sometimes in the region of 2 years. Now, if there's going to be, if we want to give cause for anybody not to invest in Northern Ireland in relation to renewables, I think that's a major concern. How concerned is the regulator in relation to, how concerned are Sony in relation to the delays in the system in relation to renewable projects and helping to meet the target?
As I said before, we're looking at how we can maybe invest in the grid in a more kind of anticipatory or strategic method. And at the moment, we've difficult decisions to make in that regard because we have many wind farm operators, solar farm operators, battery operators looking to get connections to the grid, but we have limited actual points of connection, so we have to invest heavily. So we need to kind of make those decisions. The current timelines would mean that if a wind farm, for argument's sake, takes 2 years to get planning consent, Sony would then have to follow up and get planning consent for the grid infrastructure that's needed to connect it to the wind farm. So that could add another 3 years by the time we engineer that. So you can see very quickly that we're up against 2030. So say we want to make some of those decisions in parallel. We would see there's a benefit to that, so we can work in parallel. But really, we need to bring those timelines down very quickly to be able to, get the renewables connected. So,
thank you, Chair.
I'm just going to make just very briefly there.
It's a follow-up on the PAC. What's your understanding of the impact on the capacity of the PAC, given the goldmine application?
It's just something I'm only kind of aware of at a very high level, so I haven't looked at it in depth. I mean, the projects that we're bringing forward, I would hope can be dealt with at local council level, and therefore wouldn't have to go that far.
Okay, I don't want to speculate further.
Chair, And thanks very much for the presentation. I'm glad both of you in your answers said that this is a complex matter. That certainly put my mind at ease. But Gareth, in response to Mike, you in one of his questions, you talked about us using electricity that's imported at the expense of electricity produced here. Can you explain just why that is and the rationale for it, and if that's something that's going to continue long term?
I suppose maybe just to put the caveat out there now that I'm not a sort of market subject matter expert, as it is hugely complex, but I think perhaps when the committee visits Sony in September, we can set up a more detailed briefing on how this works at a sort of market level, because it's complex even for Alan and I. But I suppose structurally, where we import electricity from GB because the wholesale price of electricity over there is cheaper than it is here. And Alan mentioned earlier about some of the challenges of managing a power system in transition. It can raise what feel like slightly counterintuitive scenarios whereby we're producing too much generation and we have too little demand for it. So, for example, if you think during the night, we're all in bed, we're not using much electricity, but it's often very windy during the night. And the security standards that we have for the grid mean that we have to have a certain amount of conventional generation on the system to keep the system stable, which is slightly different from having enough electricity, the measures that we need to keep it stable. So that means there's times where we are importing electricity into Northern Ireland and we have already too little demand to satisfy the generation that we're producing because it's very windy. And that means there's times when we're having to not utilise the wind that we have here in Northern Ireland. We're acutely aware of the concern about this, and we're doing a lot of studies at the moment to try and understand, as you say, Philip, what it means in the longer term. Are we going to see this more going forward? But I suppose there are good structural reasons why we should be thinking about this now, because I suppose the Great Britain grid and energy system, it's so much bigger, so it benefits from economies of scale, and so we need to understand whether that's going to continue over time and whether we're going to continue to see the flow of electricity that way when we're thinking about all of this going forward. But I say happy to organise a more detailed briefing for the committee on that when they visit us.
Okay, I think that would be useful. And so I'll park all my questions in relation to that. In terms of, we're an all-Ireland electricity market. Have Sony concerns about the growth of data centres and the volume of electricity being used by data centres, and how do we combat that?
Well, I think it's fair to say there's no large-scale data centres currently in Northern Ireland. There are some data centres looking to get connected, and we would encourage and support that economic growth, being it is seen as a benefit from an economy perspective. The timing and how quickly they look to get connected obviously can put stresses on the grid. But it is an option to actually utilise that renewable generation that we potentially have. As Gareth says, there's times where we have to turn it down because there is no demand. So provided we have the insight into when it's looking to get connected, we can plan ahead and make sure the grid's ready for that type of investment.
And accept what you're saying about none in the north, but there's obviously a lot in the south, and we are a single electricity market. So, is there a knock-on impact in terms of cost or supply from that?
It does mean that there's to cover, particularly when those data centres may be operating, they'll continue to operate at tea time peaks whenever everyone else is looking to use the electricity for to heat their food in their house or run their washing machines, etc. So that means that there has to be that additional capacity built to actually serve that peak demand. So it does put pressure on the system, and as Gareth was saying, the market is designed that we have it's called a marginal pricing system in our market. So the lowest cost generation that's looking to get to supply the demand will be deployed to generate that electricity. And we're seeing more, as technology develops, traditional gas turbine type power plants are getting more efficient. We're using more renewable generation to serve demand, but the intermittency of that is always a challenge. So the question will be is how we, particularly whenever the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining, how we still meet that demand. And as I touched on in my opening remarks, smart metering and people being able to turn down their demand at times is vitally important as well. So we can actually, where people have choices to make and they can turn off their electricity and potentially be incentivised to do that, as we've seen in other jurisdictions, could be a benefit there.
I think, Philip, as well, we're starting to see more innovation in terms of how large, and I suppose it isn't just data centres, but it's just other large energy users are contracting out for their electricity. So you see in Ireland, and there's a couple in Northern Ireland, but you see what are called sort of corporate power purchase agreements, where large energy users and companies will contract directly for a specific period of time, maybe 10, 15 years, in exchange for a sort of certain price. And they're often contracting that now with renewables companies and organisations. So there are kind of innovative solutions to some of these challenges going forward as well. And as Alan mentioned, some of the technologies that we're hoping to see in the next few years will help us manage those sort of large scale demands for electricity going forward.
Okay, and then just finally, kind of a local question, maybe an update on the Mid-Antrim upgrade project, and a very local one then. As part of that, any plans, or what are the plans, I suppose, long term for the substation in Rasharkin? Very local.
Yeah, so I suppose we're in sort of part two of our what we call our 3-part process. So we're at the process where we'll be starting to sort of finalise the route for that project and start to prepare a planning submission for that. We've been engaging and been on this project now for probably 3 to 4 years, and actually we were really pleased that we were able to use Mid-Antrim as a pilot for our sort of first more deliberative community forum type of engagement, where we worked with an independent public participation charity to work with local communities in a much more deliberative type of engagement, which was really successful, and we see ourselves rolling that out for projects going forward. And that's going way beyond the sort of come to the community hall and let us show you around the drawings. That it's much deeper and more deliberative than that. So yeah, we're at the point now where we'll be finalising all of that feedback from those consultations and from that engagement with the local community, and starting to prepare the planning submission. But I think Alan mentioned that project is a critical part of reaching the 2030 targets. That part of the grid is quite constrained, so it's an area again where we're having to constrain down wind, and the quicker we can make that upgrade, the quicker we can release those renewables onto the wider Northern Ireland system.
We'll come back to me in Rasharkin.
We'll come back to Sinead.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and thanks, Alan and Gareth, for your updates. As the systems operator, how comfortable and confident are you that we will reach our 2030 targets?
Hopefully during the kind of discussion, I kind of outlined how complex and challenging it is. Time is the key challenge in all of this. So it's something that it's very early to say in terms of can we hit the 2030 targets. To say we have a roadmap that would set out how we can get there in terms of the grid, but also not just the grid, but what systems we need to invest in terms of our control system, and also the markets that we would need to see evolve. So I mean, certainly it's achievable, but it does need everyone to really get behind a sense of urgency and accelerate their own plans, because as I said at the start, Sony is only one cog in a wheel of many hundreds of stakeholders, and the investment that's needed across both from private entities but also the people like ourselves and NI Networks is huge. So there's a lot involved, and there's still a lot of good engagement to have with the regulator and with the Department for Economy, but also Department of Agriculture as well, in terms of how we go about that.
Yeah, and I suppose that we have taken evidence from various organisations, and they too have stated their concerns and the complexity of it. But in relation now, we've returned here, we've got ministers in place. Are you confident that the Department for the Economy has shifted gear sufficiently in order to make sure that we do reach those targets? And do you believe that there is enough cross-governmental and cross-departmental working in place that will see the changes that we need to see, and that momentum gathering pace within the next, because it's a very short period. You're saying it's early days yet. It's a very short period before 2030, and these are major infrastructure projects. Are you seeing that pace and momentum at this particular moment in time? And as a committee here, what should we be saying to the department?
I think it's fair to say that, yes, we have seen a kind of increase in pace from the department, but we've had a very close working relationship with the department, both in terms of the development of the energy strategy, but also in terms of the in terms of what's needed and give our support. Said before, we've no vested interest in terms of building things, but we're up for the challenge. And look, we're really happy to continue to support and work with the department. We have, from what we're involved in terms of, for example, offshore wind working groups, in terms of the working groups around the emissions modelling and energy modelling, we see a huge amount of involvement across the departments in terms of what's been done. So we'd encourage that to continue, and we'd encourage the department to reach out to us for any further support they need. But we're happy to step up.
I suppose from the perspective of the committee, I definitely think there are policy options that we collectively could consider that would help us accelerate progress. So in our written submission, we've set out what some of those are. So Alan mentioned already shifting to a more anticipatory approach to investing in the grid, which would help reduce the timescales. I suppose allowing us to plan the grid more strategically. We've talked a bit about planning reform. We've talked about some of those policy options around community benefit, landowner engagement. We've talked about the extension of the utility regulators' remit to give them the scope to make the decisions that will help us get there as well. So there are certainly policy options that we can consider, and that frankly we need to consider at this point in terms of where we are that would help push us on.
Okay, and just finally, the transition plan indicates that the cost of these infrastructure changes are around 729.4 something million. I'm not sure, I've scribbled something down here. And obviously it's the consumer over a 10-year period that bears the cost. How confident are you on that transition plan costing?
Firstly, I think that the recovery is over maybe a longer period. I think it's in the order of 40 years recovery timescale in terms of how those costs are recovered via consumers' bills. The cost is any infrastructure project. There's inflation in global markets across the world, and we keep a very close eye on the construction costs, and work very closely with any networks. And as we bring projects forward, we always look, before we make any investment decisions, at that point in time, is it still the right investment decision with a positive cost benefit for consumers? So we won't bring any project forward if doesn't meet that very high bar. But yeah, yes, look, we've seen pressure on project prices across the globe. We're not unique in that, but certainly something that we're very conscious of.
I suppose also there's a cost in not doing some of these upgrades as well. So we just talked about the Mid-Antrim project. It's costing in the region of 10 million a year, approximately, in constraints. So where we're having to compensate developers for them not being able to use the wind that they're generating. So there is a cost to not doing these projects as well. And we recently engaged with a man called Nick Windsor, who's the Electricity Networks Commissioner in GB, and he's quite passionate about talking about the whole project costs. So trying to get into more holistic kind of cost benefit analysis of what we're doing here, which takes into account things like the future benefit to consumers of doing this, as well as just the sort of hard and fast cost benefit analysis that we're normally used to.
Yeah, and I suppose we're hearing constantly, regarding city deals and things like that, inflation and delay is cost as well. So that was just trying to get into the detail. One small, obviously the single electricity market. How has Brexit impacted, or what challenges has that put in place for you in terms of the single electricity market?
I think it's fair to say it's probably had minimal impact in terms of the operation and wholesale electricity prices. There was some trading on the interconnectors that was called day-ahead trading, which is no longer possible. But we are working with counterparts in GB and Europe around how we can reintegrate that day-ahead type trading in interconnectors as we move forward. But there's probably high-level policy areas that aren't quite agreed upon between GB, EU, in some of that space. But once those decisions are made, we'll look to enact whatever decisions are made there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And just as a quick supplementary, just to the question there around the capital costs, obviously inflation, but looking down your the table that you provided in the transmission development plan, to go localised, I see the Colkera Killamallet Strabane project went from 6 million to 16.3 million. Is that solely down to inflation? So I noticed there's big differences in terms of different projects. Some are coming under, others are over. Is it solely inflation? Or?
Yeah, there's construction inflation, there's material inflation. So all those are taken into account, yeah. And I suppose some of the projects, the costs are, it may not be a single year jump in terms of the cost. As we start to develop the project further, we'll be looking at the solutions that are needed. So the technology that we think is the right technology may change. So, but that project, for example, again, it's got huge cost benefit analysis that's order of magnitude greater than the investment that's needed. So again, that's probably not the key consideration in that project. It's more around the environmental impact and the societal impact on these projects. But yeah.
Thank you for that. Audric is online, so hopefully we can see and hear him shortly.
We won't be able to see him. I think he's having some technical difficulties. We should be able to hear him if our broadcasting will switch on his microphone. Hold on.
Audric,
Just give us a minute.
Yeah, that should be letting me in now.
there you go. Go ahead, Paddy.
Can you hear me okay?
We can indeed, yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Look, most of my questions have already been kind of answered, I suppose, in some detail. I would like a wee bit more information around the plan to incentivise that you mentioned in one of your answers there. So really around what that looks like in practice, but also around how we can incentivise microgeneration, and I suppose what needs to be done as well to ensure that that's done safely.
There's other models around how we incentivise consumers to adjust their demand behaviours. At the moment, we've like the suppliers, the electricity suppliers out there offer different tariffs for when electricity is used, the time of day. But if we could move to more real-time signals around the actual cost of electricity, it would potentially allow consumers to turn down demand or use their electricity at times where the actual wholesale electricity market cost is lower. But smart meters are key to that, because at the moment the type of metering we have is quite a blunt instrument for determining how much electricity is used. We just know historically we're creatures of habit. Everyone gets up typically in the morning around 6 o'clock, turns on their kettles, etc. So we see a peak in demand in the morning, and then we see another one in the evening when people come home from work. So as we move to decarbonise, heating and transport, without that smart controls of the electricity grid, the peak demand's just going to increase. So we need to spread that out across the day, because if we look to increase the peak demand, we have to find ways of meeting that demand, which typically means more generation capacity being built, which may not be needed then in the middle of the night, as Gareth talks around, when demand is low. So if we can shift that demand to the middle of the night, it would be a hugely benefit for the overall cost to consumers. And look, there's models out there across the world. GB has a scheme in place that allows the consumers to avail of that. So there's things there could be utilised to follow if it's right for Northern Ireland. In terms of advising,
I'm still not really sure what that means for a consumer. So if I'm a consumer, what does that look like? What does that incentivization model look like in practice? So I'm clear now on when it can happen, how it happens, all that, but what does it look like in practice for a consumer?
I mean, if you're able to see if the supplier's predicting what the price will be ahead of time, you could change your behaviour to use that electricity when it's less expensive. So you'd be getting real-time information as to what's happening in terms of the pricing of your electricity. So you could actually make those decisions at the point in time. So hopefully that.
Maybe to give it more.
And how kind of live is that information? I mean, are you getting that information daily, weekly, monthly? How often is that updated, and how much flexibility does that give consumers? Because I appreciate you've answered a huge number of the questions that I had around it. So really appreciate the presentation. I'm just still a wee bit confused on how that looks for consumers. So do they get daily information, weekly, monthly? How often can they have that flexibility? How can they shift that? Thinking particularly for people who are working, people who are going out the door at a certain time, coming back at a certain time in the day. Essentially, they're kind of locked in to using at those times, and obviously those are natural peak times. So how does it benefit ordinary working families?
The modern technology on smart meters now is almost real time. So as opposed to look at it tangibly, if you're a consumer, you will be able to see how much electricity you're using in almost real time on your meter, which is very different to what we have now. And that opens up a whole range of possibilities in terms of what you might be able to do on your phone, for example. So there are apps now that will link to your smart meter. That means if you are at work, you'll be able to see how much electricity you'll be using. You might be able to program your washing machine. We're moving into the era of smart homes in this respect. So again, from our point of view as the grid operator, you might be able to tangibly plan your washing machine to go on at 2 a.m. when our demand is low, and therefore you might be able to avail of a lower price. So it's sort of, we sort of refer to it almost as prosumers, where consumers will be playing a very, very active role in their energy usage and just in the energy sort of system more generally. And I suppose, maybe to give another tangible example, National Grid have a service called the Demand Flexibility Service. And because people have smart meters, they can identify the homes across Northern Ireland and the appropriate meters. And if you agree when demand and generation is a bit tight, and when National Grid needs some support for the grid, if you agree to use less electricity at that moment in time, you actually get money off your bill. So there are cost savings to your bill. So I hope that's useful just in terms of trying to provide a bit more of a tangible picture as to what that actually looks like for consumers.
If I could just add as well, we're looking at, as more of our generation is becoming weather dependent, we are looking at the weather patterns ahead of time. So we'll be able to forecast the amount of power that could be generated by wind. We have also the information from the power stations, their availability. So ahead of time, consumers will be able to get a picture of and be able to plan ahead of time as well as to when we would expect the costs to be low. So there is that. It won't just be real time; it'll be ahead of time as well.
Yeah, no, that's useful, and I mean, it certainly clarified a couple of the points. I'm still a bit concerned around the fact that people who, mightn't be able to avail of those services, are then disadvantaged. I mean, have you done any kind of a quality impact assessment around that and around who this is actually going to impact?
No, we haven't done any studies, particularly in that sense at this stage. It's probably fair to say it's still early days, as at this stage smart meters aren't being rolled out, but it's certainly something that'll have to be considered. But I think for people that might be out working from 9 to 5, as you say, they'll be able to potentially, as Gareth says, plan. There's obviously things that people can't do without, but there are certain things that potentially people can choose. When they turn on their washing machine, for example, would be a big one. When they turn on their oven, that type of thing. If they shift that by maybe small amounts of time, it could save hugely.
This is in Northern Ireland. This is where we're blessed to have organisations like the Consumer Council who can play a really valuable role in terms of helping educate consumers about these initiatives going forward. And I know in GB there's an entire national campaign around the smart meter rollout, again to help particularly vulnerable customers, people who would have challenges to accessing and utilising that technology. So I think if that is the direction of travel that Northern Ireland takes in terms of the smart meter rollout, certainly there is plenty of opportunity for those organisations to sort of step in and provide that really important information support.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting conversation, and I really appreciate the detail on it. It's just that I do have, I suppose, a concern for those people, as you say, who can't access that. I'm thinking of elderly people who are in shared accommodation, and a lot of other people who kind of fall under those different brackets. So really interesting conversation. Key to kind of hear some more from you in the future as well. But thanks for your presentation.
Okay, thanks, Padraig. And David?
Thank you, and thank you guys for coming in. I kind of waited to put my name because I was sort of so many questions, I didn't know where to go. So it was like, I feel like doing exams and you start revising and you think you know everything until you start revising, and you know absolutely very little. And the more you look at energy, the more complicated and more difficult it gets. So I appreciate you coming in and answering. I'm coming from a place of prioritising decarbonisation of energy and renewable, so that's where I'm coming from. I also come from a place of wanting to work on the island in partnership and where it's of mutual benefit and betterment for everyone here, and to bring better service and pricing for consumers. And basically what you said a second ago was about Sony and the same group and the ownership, and I understand that it's one system, but you said we've added I think Johnny asked it, and we've added another layer of sort of governance, if you like, on the Sony over EirGrid. And is that not just simply adding more cost to the consumer? And would it not be cheaper just to operate as one unit rather than have two artificial units rather than just one system?
So I think it's fair to say we're at the early stage of the implementation of the new governance requirements. The utility regulator consulted widely on the proposed licence changes, and we did flag that this would have an increased cost to consumers by putting in that additional level of governance and separation of resources and management. But we're looking to implement that as efficiently as possible. We're looking to make sure we have the local skills and resources available to us, and continue to work in partnership with EirGrid in areas of mutual benefit. So we are, as the SONI board has asked us to, we're actually working closely with EirGrid to see where we can find areas of mutual working. But that will continue regardless of the governance arrangements. So we will look to make sure that we're both learning from each other and making sure we adopt the right innovation in terms of our business going forward.
Yeah, no, listen, okay, I appreciate you're following what you're being told. I appreciate that, but what I'm getting at is we're effectively siloing ourselves off to cost more to the consumer. This will cost more as this rolled into the consumer in Northern Ireland.
All I can say is we're trying to do that as efficiently as possible in accordance with the licence.
Yeah, okay. No bother. Then second, just to pick up on what Mike actually said, and then Philip came in. So, and this relates to this. So, the interconnector from Scotland bringing in, effectively they're on scale, so it's cheaper. So the interconnector most of the time will work in one direction, where we're bringing in from Scotland, to the detriment effectively then of the renewable industry here, if I'm understanding that correctly, or we're not using so if price is cheaper Scotland, maybe a better way, and we're bringing it in to here, are we paying for wind turbines to be sitting and not being used by bringing it in from Scotland?
So again, it's quite a complex set of market arrangements. Some of the older wind farms would be getting those what's called a constraint payment when that happens. But you also have to consider that the cost of, or the price of importing that is ultimately bringing down the cost of wholesale electricity for consumers on the island of Ireland. So there is a positive benefit there as well. But that's why it's really, we need to be very careful about how quickly we build out I want to say how quickly industry builds out the renewable generation on the island. We need to consider really, do we need to have all of the renewable generation here in Northern Ireland, or should we be looking at as a wider geographical area with GB, with the rest of Ireland? Ultimately, the benefit of potentially bringing in that lower cost electricity from Scotland, it is also likely to be green electricity, so to speak, as well. So ultimately, it's clean electricity that is being used. So there's a lot of policy things that have to be considered. If we invest and build out too quickly here, well then again potentially that oversupply problem becomes even more challenging. And but ultimately there's policy rules in place from a European context that dictate how operators are compensated when system operators can't use all of the electricity that they're looking to export.
And I think that it's sort of, in this particular example as well, the North-South Interconnector is also an incredibly important enabling project from an operational perspective. I think sometimes when people think about the North-South Interconnector, they think just about security supply and just about importing when our grid is tight, but it's also important for me being able to use the renewables that we have and being able to manage, as Alan said, that potential situation where we've got too many renewables and we need to be able to get them out. I think there are some long-term technological solutions that will help with this as well. So we talked a bit about long-duration energy storage. We've talked a bit about the potential for green hydrogen being used as well going forward. But there is a lead-in time for those technologies, and we are seeing some challenges with having to manage that in the short term whilst we're waiting for those technologies to come along. I think it'd be fair to say, as a system operator, we're still trying to get under the skin of what this issue is, and because as Alan said, it is really a complex set of market arrangements. So we're still doing the studies to understand, why we're seeing these import flows in the way we are over the sort of the last couple of months, and we know the industry, it is something they're very concerned about. So we are committed to looking at what we can do in the short term to assist with that. But as Alan said, it is, from a policy making perspective, it is something that we have to really think about going forward.
Thanks, Gareth, because I was going to say surely the North-South connector then is absolutely key, and you've kind of answered that. So just to sort of kind of to move on to, you talk about network planning, if you look at again, I'm thinking island wide, and then within the islands and in Europe, but you know, it said, reading through your thing, it said about, you know, having favoured locations and having places, which is kind of a planned system. I kind of, suppose in my own head, coming from a construction background, you have an architect's set of drawings and that's what you work to, and you deliver on kind of a plan. You don't just shotgun and hope for the best. And whenever you mentioned their backup services and bringing in that storage of energy, where does that plan come from? Where does that design? Because does that not then help with the planning service? If we had like a council or coming up with local development plans, does Sony have that kind of plan that they go, we want this here, whatever, in whatever area, wind in this area or solar here? Is that down on paper that we can look at like a local development plan? Is that?
Yeah, what we talked about earlier, the transmission development plan, it's a 10-year plan that sets out all of the projects that need to be done to reinforce the grid. Based on the information we know today. What we don't know today is, for example, we do know that there's obviously wind farms going through the planning system out there, and we work closely with the renewables industry to get, you know, as much information in that space as possible that they're prepared to share with us. But because the grid is so limited in terms of capacity, we can only build, you know, the grid out for projects that are actually going to turn up. There's been big problems in GB that are widely reported about the number of projects that have connection agreements to get connected to the grid, but they may never actually build projects. We're fortunate that we have a milestone on our process that they have to have planning permission before they can get in and accept an offer. But that does mean that it can hold the overall plan up. But we're aware, as say, of these projects. We know that there's projects in terms of offshore grid connections that could potentially be interesting, but they're not at the point yet where they're ready to accept the grid connection offer. But because we know that, we would like to be able to go ahead and plan now that they will turn up eventually and start to do the high level plans, as you say, like the architect's blueprint of what would be needed to connect those. So it's a relatively small investment because we're not actually investing in any concrete or copper. We could do the plans, be ready for those people when they come forward to shorten the timescales overall.
But you're right, David, I think to point out there is a bit of a tension in terms of how we have historically developed the grid. So we've taken previously what's called a sort of developer-led approach. So if you come to us and you want to connect to the grid, regardless of the technology, regardless of where it's at, we must issue you a connection offer. Now, there are some exemptions to that, but largely speaking, that's the picture. And you'll see in our written evidence we've talked about moving to more of a plan-led approach where we could start to, back to your point about, you know, where's the wind, where do the batteries go. Historically, that's not where we really are at the moment. We would certainly favour a policy discussion about moving to a place where we could have that slightly more coordinated approach so that we know where we need the batteries, we know where we want the wind. And you're right, that would do the front-loading thinking that might assist with local development plans and the council, but at the moment we're sort of having to react to people who want to connect to the grid, and as I say, it can lead to, you know, some technologies emerging that we maybe don't need, and some of the ones that we do need not emerging. So we would certainly welcome an opportunity to discuss that.
Yeah, it just seems to me it's back to front. That needs to be that happening. You know, I understand, and totally you're coming from a place where you had 3 power stations and, you know, it was simple, you turn the switch on and as you said, you turn it off whenever you didn't need it, where you're moving to move that across. But it's that moving across that it needs the plan. It's where that comes from. And then my final point was actually around that. You mentioned the hydrogen and the interconnection policy that the South have brought through, is because that's all part of the same kind of plan, is where that plan comes from. Are you kind of looking that policy that they have in the South just replicated in the North, or who comes up with something different? Is that, I'm trying to get this needs to be planned through, if you like. And
I think we're aware that the Department for Economy are working on an interconnected policy for Northern Ireland specifically, and we're happy to engage and support as they roll that out. And there's other examples of how that's been done elsewhere as well that could be utilised. But, you know, as the conversation's gone, you know, it is such a complex area that, and the large, you know, it's huge investment decisions that are hanging off the back of all of this type of thing. So it's key that it's done right.
The department recently consulted. It was quite a wide-ranging consultation, but within that they did look at interconnection and hydrogen policy, and obviously, as you would expect, we work very closely with the gas TSOs here in Northern Ireland around what the future of that network looks like and what the opportunities for collaboration might be.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, David, and thanks to Alan and to Gareth for your detail that you've given in terms of obviously your briefing, but also in terms of the questions. And there's a good range. I think there's a clear recognition that there's a tough ask in terms of meeting the targets that we have set for 2030. But it's going to require, of course, all cogs in the wheel working together. We've heard issues around planning and other things. And the committee has a keen interest in those. Obviously, we don't have responsibility for all of that, but we do look forward to coming back to you or meeting with you in September. And hopefully we can gather additional questions that we have and bring them to you at that point. But at this stage, I just want to thank you for engaging with us, and we look forward to working with you in the weeks ahead. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Members, I'm proposing we're going to summarise just obviously what we've heard and any actions, and then maybe just take a short comfort break for a few moments just to allow people to get organised. So, Peter, do you want to maybe summarise in terms of some of the actions that we've received here?
Is the committee content to write to Sony just seeking further information on the efficiency of interconnectors and how they might interact, and also seeking a briefing on the economics of interconnection and how it might affect renewable generation in Northern Ireland? Additionally, excuse me, members want to ask Sony if they can provide us some information about their smart metering plans and the kind of energy efficiency options that they may provide for householders, etc. And I presume the member herself will go back on Resharkin substation. Do you want the committee to do that?
I'll do that myself.
That's okay, I thought as much. If that's members are content with that, Chair.
You content?
Yes.
Yeah, everybody content? Okay. Well, let's just take a short, we'll maybe come back at 11:20. Yeah.
Committee Room 30. Sound. 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 Committee.
Okay, members, you're all very welcome back, and can I extend a very warm welcome to the utility regulator, John French, obviously the Chief Executive Officer, Kevin Shields is Executive Director, Markets and Consumer Protection, and Peter Russell, Executive Director, Price Controls, Networks and Energy Futures. You're very welcome to the committee. I know you've been listening in as well in terms of the Sony's contribution. So I'm just going to invite you now maybe to give some opening remarks and statements, and then we'll ask some questions and get the members' views as well. So over to yourself, John.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much for the opportunity to come today. As you probably know, the utility regulator is the economic regulator for electricity, gas and water in Northern Ireland. We're the only multi-sectorial economic regulator in the UK, covering both energy and water. Like other regulators in the UK, we're an independent, non-ministerial government department, and our main duty is to protect the short-term and long-term interests of consumers. Our role is to make sure that the energy and water industries in Northern Ireland are regulated correctly and developed within ministerial policy, as is set out by our statutory duties. In terms of our statutory duties, as a body, we are a creature of statute, and we can only do things that we are empowered to do by legislation. Therefore, our role is limited by the laws that created the organisation. And unlike government departments, we do not possess the royal prerogative, and therefore our roles must be defined by statute. Our role in electricity and gas is set out by 4 pieces of legislation. There was the Energy Order back in 2003, in which the utility regulator was established in its current form, and it sets out our overarching objectives in relation to electricity and gas functions. Then back in 1992 there was the electricity order that sets out our roles in terms of electricity. The gas order back in 93, which is the principal order around natural gas. Methane is the form of gas there. And then in 2007 there was the electricity single wholesale markets order, which set up the single electricity market, which we operate with our counterpart in the Republic of Ireland. And that runs the regulation of the single electricity market, as was discussed at the previous evidence session. We provided 3 annexes in our evidence that summarise our functions in relation to gas, electricity and water to members. But it's pretty obvious, the energy landscape has significantly changed in the last 20 years since the utility regulator had its last revision of its statutory powers. In contrast, our opposite number in Great Britain, Ofgem, has had at least 12 pieces of primary legislation which have amended their statutory powers. And we have to see the world in 4 ways in terms of our principal duties. Ofgem have got about 30 odd ways in which they have to see the world, which allows them more flexibility in looking towards the decarbonisation to net zero. So they can look at the reduction of greenhouse gases, they can look at sustainable development, microgeneration. They have stronger information gathering powers than us. They can do more around consumer redress and complaints handling and other things like offshore regulation. So we don't feel at the moment we have the statutory powers necessary to fully support the Northern Ireland Executive's energy strategy nor the Climate Change Act of 2022. We need new legislative powers to support the transition. And as I say, Ofgem in Great Britain and CRU in Ireland have been provided these powers, and we need a similar update to our legislative mandate. In a similar vein, in the past, elected members have called on the utility regulator to regulate heating oil, and we can only do this if we're given the statutory remit to undertake the role. We're currently working with the Department of the Economy to develop interim legislation which will enable the utility regulator to work with the department on issues related to the Climate Change Act. But this legislation will, however, not allow the utility regulator to regulate any new issues. Further, more comprehensive legislation will be needed if the utility regulator is needed to regulate issues such as heat networks, hydrogen, heating oil, if we can provide greater consumer protection here in Northern Ireland. Community benefit system schemes, we cannot do that. And if we are needed to take into account sustainability, carbon emissions in terms of our regulatory decisions. We cannot even offer, our opposite numbers can provide battery storage licenses, interconnector licenses, synchronous condenser licenses. We have to amend other licenses to try and provide Northern Ireland with those that ability for those technologies to come onshore. So there's lots of things at the moment that we're unable to do that we would like to be able to do to support the move towards net zero. But that's just the canter through for a start.
Well, thanks for that, and that was very useful. Obviously, to take one summary from that, it's clear that there's a legislative gap between what we have and what GB has. You mentioned, obviously, the 12 pieces of legislation, some of the issues that were raised by Sony and some of the issues raised by members, obviously, around the likes of the community benefit, the impact that this will have on consumers, etc., is obviously important. In terms of immediate priorities, obviously there's a legislative gap, but the impact of that, could you just talk us through a bit more in terms of the impact that it's having in terms of meeting the 2030 targets, and what would be the immediate priority? I appreciate you're working with the department. We received a briefing from the department as well in terms of the legislation that they propose to go through or to bring forward. But my understanding that hasn't it hasn't went out to consultation yet. It hasn't, so it's still a bit of time away. So can you maybe talk us through that and what would be the immediate priorities that are holding us back, obviously, in terms of the targets?
Well, what regulation does is it provides a foundation for the whole industry to develop from. It gives a solid legal foundation that allows companies to invest here in Northern Ireland. What we're having to do at the moment is use 20-year-old pieces of regulatory powers and trying to amend them to take account of the current, the new world. It's far from perfect. You know, you talked about the interconnector, the proposed interconnector from Scotland to Northern Ireland. Where Ofgem can issue an interconnector license, we haven't got the power to issue an interconnector license. So we've got to try and use a transmission license and try and amend that to make it an interconnector license. So it just reduces the foundations, you know, how solid Northern Ireland is in terms of its regulatory background, because we're using 20, 30-year-old legislation to try and do that. And it just takes things a lot longer, where Ofgem can pull that off the shelf and issue it. We then have to go through a legal process to try and make sure that that licenses are as robust as they possibly can to do that, make that purpose. So it's not efficient. And then in terms of technologies have moved on, so hydrogen, we cannot do any, you know, our legislative priorities around gas are around methane as a gas. It's not around hydrogen as a gas. So we cannot do anything in terms of pure hydrogen. So it's all these kind of things that make it a struggle for us to fulfill our, you know, potential.
Okay, and obviously we'll be working with the department as this progresses. But in terms of your own relationship with the department, do you feel that, you know, the issues that you're bringing forward are being listened to, or do you see sufficient speed there in terms of action?
Well, we're desperate to get off the subs bench, really. So we would like it, obviously, things to move faster, but we understand where the department are, and we're working with them to try and get that legislation through as quickly as possible.
Mike?
Chair, thank you very much. And yes, good morning, gentlemen. Thank you very much. It's this point, John, about your powers are on electricity and gas, but not the gas that a lot of people see as the future in its kind of rainbow of colours, hydrogen. So you don't do home heating oil, which I think is 70% of domestic houses. Mm-hmm. You don't do the gas of the future, which is hydrogen. So how debilitating is that for your ability to operate?
We cannot fulfil our potential, you know, in terms of the future for energy in Northern Ireland. But I guess it's a decision for politicians, and it's a decision for the department what they actually want the utility regulator to do, because we will fulfil our statutory mandate. So if if we're given home heating oil, we'll do home heating oil. If we're given hydrogen, we'll do hydrogen. But at the moment, we only have the powers in gas and electricity.
So an industry expert put something to me which I'm not sure whether it is accurate or not. Mm-hmm. But they said we import gas, of course, from GB. And there is a proposal to blend that gas with a percentage of hydrogen. Yes. And if that was the case under current regulations, we would have to then deblend the hydrogen at considerable cost and huge embarrassment, given we're heading for net zero.
I don't know if that's actually the case. You know, our legal advice is as long as methane makes up the majority of the gas, we can regulate it. So it wouldn't be pure, we couldn't regulate pure hydrogen, but if there was the majority of the gas that was blended remained methane, we could still regulate that gas.
So I think from a regulatory standpoint, we'd be okay, as John says, up to that, you know, kind of 49% or so mark, as long as it's mainly methane. There's probably some grid code and quality assurance issues we would need to address before hydrogen came through the pipeline and everything was kind of lined up for that. But, you know, we can move to do that ahead of that happening.
Okay, well, that's interesting, but it's also disturbing that this industry expert does not understand that up to 49% is okay. In terms of methane, anaerobic digesters, are we talking about the future being a small number of large-scale ADs?
Yeah, that's the proposal at the moment. That's some of the proposals that are out there at the moment. You know, we're the first place on this island. Last year, Dungunnon was able to inject AD gas. So that's the first on the island of Ireland. and we brought forward the regulations on that. But yeah, there's talk of whether we have biomethane refineries across Northern Ireland, which are able to bring in farm waste and one thing or another to be able to pump onto the gas system. There's a big project up in Ballymena at the moment. We're looking at chicken waste to get the biogas off that and put that onto both the distribution and transmission systems in Northern Ireland, which would be, great for the area.
So it would be a movement away from smaller ADs on farms to larger ADs, possibly based more on industrial sites.
That's what we understand, yeah. So at the moment the ADs are used to produce electricity. It's then getting the economies of scale of bringing all that waste together to allow it to be injected into the gas network.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, and just Mike, just further to your question there, see in terms of obviously the gap, if you were to take on the regulation of oil, heat, hydrogen, how much bigger would your organisation need to get?
Well, that really depends on what you want what politicians and the department want us to regulate. So there's many forms of regulation in terms of, if you're looking at home heating oil, for example, you could do full economic regulation, or you could just look at consumer standards and consumer protection. And there's different, there's different levels. So it really depends what we're asked to do. So I know I'm not answering your question in terms of pound, shilling, and pence and the head count, but it depends it really depends what we're asked to do.
Philip?
Okay, I literally was going to ask you, what does regulation of home heating oil look like, just given, so if you could maybe, give us what it would look like in terms of some of the results. And then just, the chair asked you about the legislative gap and the impact on reaching targets. Can I ask you, what, in your view, the legislative gap's impact is on consumers in terms of the prices they're paying for electricity and gas? So there's two questions for you.
I might bring Kevin into, but there's many forms of regulation. So you could do simple consumer regulation. So we provide standards in terms of for gas and electricity consumers, in terms of that the suppliers have to provide in terms of protection measures, and when especially the more vulnerable in our society, we've just launched our consumer protection program, which looks to further enhance the protection for consumers. Or you could go full economic regulation. So you could start to look at as we do with electricity and gas, how the cost of supply right through to the end user. So you could look at it like that in terms of different metrics. But I don't know, Kevin, you've done a lot more.
Just picking up some of the comments and joining up a few dots. We've done a large piece of work in the last year looking at future consumer protection and what consumer protection needed to look like in the future given the scale of change in the energy sector. So we did a joint piece of work on that with the Consumer Council, including stakeholder engagement. And one of the key messages that came out of that whole research was that regardless of the form of energy that you use, regardless of how you heat your home, whether it's oil, gas, whatever, regardless of how you power your home, that stakeholders felt that consumers should be protected. It shouldn't be about electricity and gas. It should be about consumer protection no matter how you heat your home and how you power your vehicles, etc. So strategically, that's, I suppose, the key finding from that. It lines up actually with some messages from the Department for the Economy, who've also been saying that at a senior level as a long-term aspiration. So that's an overall strategic point. In terms of then oil regulation, as one example, regulation, as John said, regulation comes in many forms. It can be very high level and very generic in the sense that in terms of oil price, for example, let's think about price. It doesn't necessarily have to be price regulation from the bottom up like we do with gas and electricity at the moment. It can be price transparency. So, for example, a consumer must be told what their price is, what the key elements of that price is, and what profit level is being taken by the oil companies in that price. That's price transparency. That's a form of regulation. The other obvious forms of regulation that would come into the oil discussion would be things like complaints handling, protection for consumers in vulnerable circumstances, and possibly protection for consumers who get into debt with their oil companies or who can't afford a top-up. So at the end of the day, it would be for people like yourselves and government to decide what elements of regulation you want. We as regulators will then deliver whatever the mandate we have to deliver. You asked about resources. I mean, in terms of resources, as John said, it does depend what we're asked to do, but basic forms of regulation don't take that many resources. It's more setting out generic high-level frameworks that the companies have to adhere to and the monitoring of that. It's not really a big resource hit. It's more getting the generic framework correct.
And to the second part of your question about where we feel there's a gap in consumer protection at the moment, is the Consumer Council can take consumer complaints and try and resolve those complaints on the behalf of a consumer. But if the company doesn't want to take that to conclusion, they decide they're not going to agree with the Consumer Council, there's no body then, unlike in GB, which then can force the company to come to a resolution. So in GB, Ofgem can force a resolution onto the company. So they have the same complaints process through Citizens Advice Bureau. And then if there cannot be an agreement, they can force the company into an agreement. We don't have those powers. We have those powers on connections, but we don't have them on other consumer redress. So that's a gap in our legislative mandate compared to GB.
I mean, I was actually thinking more macro level in terms. No, you're talking there. I think in terms of like individual complaints. I'm just thinking, is to what extent is the current deficit in what you could do impacting the broad base of consumers here in the north?
I think we're in the early days. As Sony said, we're ramping up to 2030, but that's going to become, as we get closer to that date, hopefully things are going to move faster. Our legislation is inefficient, so it's slowing things down. And if inefficiencies add cost.
What I would add to that, it's impossible to put a pound sign on it. I suppose if that's what you're asking is, we can't put a pound sign on it. What we know is that Ofgem, our equivalent in Great Britain, have had a dozen pieces of major legislation since 2000 that we haven't had. We know that a new energy bill is still some years away in Northern Ireland. The department tells us the earliest might be 2027. So, we're in that period where there's a legislative gap that we're doing our best to plaster over and paint over with the department. But we've talked about hydrogen, we've talked about offshore winds in another area, and John's given some examples. There's just gaps in what we can do, and we are a creature of statute, and we cannot step outside to do the things we cannot do under legislation.
Sinead?
Okay, thank you, Chair, and thank you for your answers so far. I suppose just coming on the back of that as well, we have been advised by the department that a substantial energy bill is required, and that would be looking at obviously the utility regulator and their capacity. He has indicated as well, or the Minister has indicated through questions, that there would be an interim bill that could move forward that would take care of some of the short term, or well, it's not even short term now, but some of the short term statutory obligations and changes that are required. But even short term is going to be quite significant, because we haven't seen, kind of what that looks like. Have you seen what that looks like, or have you engaged with the department to see what that perhaps could allow you to do moving forward?
We've only seen the piece of interim legislation that you saw yourselves, so that's all that's allowing the utility regulator to do is work on those issues. It's not allowing us to regulate those issues. And why we need that is we are a creature of statute, but also our funding mechanism is different to the rest of government. So we get about £100,000 from the block grant, but the rest of our funding is made up from a levy on energy suppliers. So it's through we would have to raise that. So what that legislation is enabling us to do is use money from electricity and gas companies to then work on other issues like hydrogen and things like that. So it's allowing us to do that kind of work, but it's not allowing us to regulate that work.
Can I just add very briefly, it's not allowing us to license new activities, it's not allowing us to actually regulate. What it's allowing us to do, and we've been working with the Department for Economy on it, what it's allowing us to do is provide advice and analysis to the department for things that they have to do, the Department for Economy have to do under the Climate Change Act. That's the substance of the paragraph, the interim piece of legislation. And therein lies one of the other constraints within it. It only allows us to advise the department on things that the DFE themselves are required to do to meet the Climate Action Plan, Climate Change Act legislation and targets. So it's not widened out to what DFI, DFC, DOF, DARA have to do to meet their aspects. One of the things we hope that the legislation would do in due course, the full energy bill in due course, would be to widen that out so that we, as independent regulators, can help Northern Ireland PLC and any government department do what they need to do to deliver the climate change goals.
Okay, and then the other area that I'm really concerned at, and I just would like to hear your thoughts on it, is Northern Ireland doesn't have an anti-poverty strategy, and we have a lot of people living, particularly in fuel poverty, and particularly in the most deprived areas as well, and they're working with fossil fuels, etc., etc. We've seen, the Ukraine war and what that actually did almost immediately. In terms of the cost for oil and that. How important is it that you as a regulator can contribute to that conversation in relation to fuel poverty, and what powers do you need in order to give more enhanced consumer protection to customers, particularly the most vulnerable, and particularly those in the most deprived areas of our region?
So, as I said, at the moment, we would like the similar powers to Ofgem, that we can enforce a decision around consumer protection, which we can't at the moment. In terms of fuel poverty in Northern Ireland, we do have the highest levels on these islands and in the UK. And that's mainly down to income. And the levels of discretionary income in Northern Ireland are significantly lower than any other region in the UK. So it's energy prices in Northern Ireland in terms of have been cheaper than GB in Ireland for domestic consumers, but that's little consternation when their actual income is lower. We need. There's three legs to the fuel poverty debate. There's the cost of energy, which we look at. Then there's the energy efficiency of the household, which is the Department of Finance in terms of building standards, and the Department for Communities in terms of support that can be provided to households. And then finally, there's the levels of income that a household receives. So we need to be part of that debate because we're one leg of that stool. But there's, it's getting that overall collective response to address fuel poverty.
We've started to engage actively with the AFC as they develop the new fuel poverty strategy, and it's great to see that being developed. It's not a mystery what drives fuel poverty, as John said. Those three pillars. We need to act on all three. I suppose the one thing I'd add to what John said is this is the one part of the UK that doesn't have any form of social tariff, as people call it, or affordability intervention. We had the government schemes a year or two ago, and that was actually a good example of where the regulator stepped up and delivered those government schemes in Northern Ireland, and that's the sort of thing we can do. The lack of any affordability intervention in Northern Ireland is one of the elements that needs to be debated within that new fuel poverty strategy, and the regulators here to help absolutely bring our expertise to that debate. In Great Britain, they've got Warm Homes Discount, which is operated within the energy sector by Ofgem, and then it's essentially a social tariff where money is collected from all households and then handed out by the energy suppliers to those in most need. So it's a good example of where the energy system can be used in a sort of affordability intervention way on a recurring annual basis. But happy to engage in that debate and bring what we can to it.
But that's another statutory thing. So Ofgem can offer social tariffs. Under our legislation, we've got to treat every consumer in Northern Ireland exactly the same. So we cannot differentiate between one consumer group to another.
And that, you know, in a place like Northern Ireland, it is absolutely fundamental that we have those type of interventions that support those that are most in need. And we're kind of not even at the, you know, the briefings that we've got, we haven't really been talking about that. We're talking about wider regulations or legislation, but the fuel poverty issue should be at the heart of it, because it's at the heart of, you know, efficiency in the homes as well. The homes that we actually build, the homes of the future, we're still building the homes of the past, and we're not even dealing with energy efficiency in any shape around that. Can I ask another question just about prices and electricity prices? Can you explain to me, this is probably a stupid question, but the carbon border adjustment mechanism, what impact does that have on the Northern Ireland prices against the UK prices for electricity?
That's still for discussion in terms of, but what we understand is Europe's included the carbon budget border mechanism for electricity, where the UK government hasn't. So there shouldn't be a carbon budget, as far as we understand, but this is all changing. There shouldn't be any adjustments on the Moyle interconnector from Scotland to Northern Ireland, as that's part of the UK. There shouldn't be any adjustments in terms of if there's north-south flows from Northern Ireland to the Republic of Ireland. But there could be adjustments between the interconnectors between Wales and Ireland. But I think we couldn't give you a definitive answer at the moment, because it's still up for negotiation, and it's still to be decided whether Europe's going to take forward to remove electricity from its menu of adjustments that it's proposing.
We don't know yet.
We don't know yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hey, David.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for coming in. I'm going to start by saying, as I did with Sony, you know, the basis of this is I want to see decarbonisation of energy and renewables. I want to work in partnership across the island for the betterment of everybody when we've got systems like that, and delivering better value for customers. But whenever we were talking to Sony there, and I questioned the air grid and the separation of that, when we have one electricity market, we have one system, one of the comments said we've added an additional layer. Is that not just simply add an additional layer of cost to our consumers?
Well, we would say no. So we still have the single electricity market. So we still operate, the two regulators come together to operate the single electricity market. What we have is we have a license with Sony, and CRU, our opposite number, have a license with EirGrid. We didn't feel when we did our investigation that we had the transparency around the operations of Sony. So the extra cost, we believe, is needed in terms of good governance to see what the costs Northern Ireland consumers are actually paying. So the model always was that, until politically it's decided differently, that Sony look for VAT for Northern Ireland, EirGrid VAT for the Republic of Ireland, and then they come together to do a united piece for the single electricity market. What was happening, in our opinion, was we were getting everyone. EirGrid Group was looking at what was best on an all-island market, and then trying to bring it down to the various component parts. And sometimes Northern Ireland consumers were losing out on that split. So we feel, and at the moment, because the practicalities of it is Northern Ireland has an energy policy and Ireland has an energy policy. So we need the ability to make Sony, who've got a hugely important job, to be able to ensure that they can fulfil decisions in Northern Ireland, and EirGrid likewise can fulfil decisions in Ireland. But then that needs to come together to jointly run the single electricity market. So we felt there wasn't that governance, there wasn't that transparency in the costs, that who was paying what, and it was worth that. It was worth that additional level of governance within the process.
Okay, so I understand the politics in this, and I'm not demeaning that in any way. I'm just looking from the consumer of going, how do you get the best value for the consumer? And if the betterment is so basically what you're saying is the energy policy, the differential of energy policy between north and south causes that to happen, that you have to act.
Yeah, it's also the practicalities that the legal system is that we've got two system operators. We've got a system operator in Northern Ireland because we haven't got a united system operator. We couldn't see we couldn't hand on heart see the transparency in the costs to say Northern Ireland consumers were getting the best deal in terms of the overall EirGrid group. So that's why we were asking for that transparency and that additional level of governance, that you've got a board that's batting for what Sony needs within the EirGrid group.
Can you see that now? Are consumers getting better value?
Well, it's early days, but it's been very positive at the moment. The new Sony board is meeting with the EirGrid board and challenging the costs, in terms of the split of costs on an all-island basis and making sure that they are reflective of actually what Northern Ireland consumers should be paying. So there is that extra level of challenge there around the overall group costs, that they're fairly allocated between the two jurisdictions.
Yeah, so ultimately prices, that's what I'm trying to get at. So the Northern Ireland consumer prices will start to come down over time? Right?
Well, we'd hope so. We'd hope to see that price transparency. So we're encouraged in terms of, as Alan was saying, Campbell, the new Sony board's been in 6 months. We've had a board-to-board meeting with the new board. We're very encouraged by the level of scrutiny that board's starting to bring to costs within the Sony organisation and the overall group. So yeah, hopefully we'll start to see those kind of changes.
And then finally, just your executive summary, it says the three of them were ensuring security of electricity supply, ensuring competitiveness of the national economy, and ensuring the long-term sustainability of electricity supply. What happens, and I agree with all three, but what happens if they conflict with each other? And how can we ensure you deliver all three of value, with sustainability and security? What happens if they conflict?
Well, that's taken back to a board decision, but we've got to keep the lights on. Keeping the lights on is the most important thing in a modern economy. So, security of supply always will take priority.
100%.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for your presentation this morning. I suppose probably firstly I would disagree with David on the analysis that the extra governance in place with Sony in relation to its relationship with EirGrid actually is just adding cost to the consumer. I actually believe it has the possibility to save the consumer in the longer term, because we will have more accountability, more ability to challenge decisions to ensure that Northern Ireland consumers are ultimately protected in the wider scheme. So I'll just put that out there. In relation to the security of supply, and I'm just repeating obviously the questions that I've asked, because it's important that we hear both aspects on that. So on security of supply, the generation capacity statement from Sony suggested that there could be increased issues and limited disruption, whether that's brownouts, power cuts, whatever. And now they were keen to stress that was not there. They hope that wouldn't happen eventually, but they could never root it out. So can the utility regulator advise on the measures it will require Sony and others to take in order to avoid the possibility of power cuts or brownouts?
Yes, so we have that role around the generation capacity statement in terms of approving it. And we've gone through a difficult winter, because this is the first winter that Northern Ireland's gone through with only having 2 power stations. Kilroot coal-fired power station closed at the end of September. We went through a winter for the first time ever with only Kilkira up in Derry, Londonderry and Ballylumford operating. And as you heard, there was greater use of the interconnectors and wind supply. What Northern Ireland has Northern Ireland's Northern Ireland's done really well, and I think sometimes we miss that. The amount of renewables on the system, wind renewables and solar renewables, is higher than anywhere else in the world. What we don't have that other nations have is hydro and nuclear power that give us stable base load. So we're having to, the system operator at Sony is having to balance that on a much more. So that's the level of complexity that comes in with Northern Ireland. And there is months when you look at it, I didn't believe it at first, but when you look at it, there is months where the wind doesn't blow. And it's those months where we struggle to keep, the lights on. But when we talk about keeping the lights on and the emergencies that Sony was saying, they're technical emergencies in terms of a very conservative system. So the energy system is run very, very, very conservatively. It's not built on fine margins or things like that. So when they're saying things are low, there's all those, there's everything's built in beforehand in terms of that security of supply behind. But no one can guarantee that the lights won't go off. And that's because, particularly with Northern Ireland, we haven't got that baseload generation from like nuclear power or from hydro. So we're having to use renewables that are less reliable on the system to bring that forward.
Before we come on to the exciting possibilities of what the future holds for Northern Ireland, in particular in relation to its renewables, but you've mentioned some of the vulnerabilities in the system, and I recognise that as well. Is it an increasing concern of the utility regulator in relation to brownouts or power cuts? And scalability, is that rising, or?
I think it's always there, but that would be a fluke rather than a planned. It wouldn't be something that we would expect. It would be, if everything went wrong.
So for Northern Ireland to harness the potential that you talked about, what would be the key pillar asks to ensure that we can transform to harness the true potential and bring some stability to the energy market here?
Well, if we're going to meet our 2030 targets, we need the planning system to support it. We need to meet 2030, all the stars have to align. So we need to make sure planning speeds up. We need to bring back in support for renewables, and there was an announcement that next year there would be a support scheme for renewable generation. And we need things like the North-South Interconnector. So, North-South Interconnector increases security of supply, but it also provides a route to market for those wind farms that are in Northern Ireland to export their electricity when we don't need as much as they're generating. But we need speed. We need to operate at speed to fulfill our potential.
And last question, what is your understanding of the expected timescales for the North-South Interconnector?
It'll be similar to Sony's, but I think from speaking to stakeholders, we're very confident that the northern portion can be built. It's the 2/3 in the south where the difficulties will lie.
And what's your understanding of where that is in relation to the 2/3 in the south?
It's a bit behind where we are, but still everyone's aiming for that late 2027 deadline. But there's huge costs there's 40 to 50 million pounds extra being charged to consumers across the island because we don't have the North-South Interconnector. So the single electricity market operates theoretically, first and foremost, so it's always the cheapest supplier that comes on. But then there's a truism behind that looks at what the physical market can do. And because there isn't enough interconnection north and south, those imperfections, as it is called, imperfections charges are added on to the cost to consumers because you cannot flow down the motorway. So it's those additional costs that have been charged to consumers on an annual basis because we don't have the North-South Interconnector, or those projects of grid strengthening in other regions of Northern Ireland and the south.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Thanks.
Thanks, Johnny. We've no indicated speakers for additional questions, but just a final one from me, just in terms of that consumer cost. Obviously, there's a concern. what will be the benefits to the consumers? What will be the additional costs over time? Sinead previously mentioned just in terms of the infrastructure piece with Sony and the inflation, the cost, the additional costs that could be a burden to consumers. But I suppose from your perspective in terms of the next steps and in terms of allocating those costs, how, I suppose, do you ensure that those who are going to benefit from a grid connection pay an appropriate charge? How do you play a role in that, and what would be the next steps?
Well, that is a policy decision. So the Minister announced around socialisation of connection charges earlier in the Chamber. But it depends on the level. So someone's got to pay for the costs somewhere. Yeah. So if it's full socialisation, it gets spread across the whole of the consumer base. But there's an element, as you say, does the wind farm developers pay a certain element to domestic customers? And I think that granularity of detail needs to be thought through.
Do you have any opinion from your perspective on that?
It goes back to the point. We already have the most vulnerable consumer base of any. So the costs to some consumers just simply can't afford the energy at the moment, and the transition will add additional costs to consumers. So it's trying to make that transition fair.
Making it fair, and I think that we all want to meet our net zero targets, but the reality is that people are struggling as it is in terms of their costs, and so it's something that we no doubt will be following very closely as well as we go forward. But I suppose just at this stage, I thank you for your presentation and for answering all the questions that we've had. It'll not be the last, obviously, that we engage with you, so we look forward to hearing from you again.
Yeah, and
thanks.
If any detailed briefing on a certain subject, happy to do that as well.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, members, so I'm just going to ask the clerk now to, as best as he can, summarise what we've just heard and any actions that are coming out of the discussion as well.
So, Chairperson, at that briefing and in the previous one, there was some reference to the infrastructure debt, the £700 million plus number, payback over 40 years, not 10 years. So, the committee can tend to write to the utility regulator just seeking what the number is, how much is the infrastructure debt now, what would it be if the net zero targets are met? So what's the cost of all the additional infrastructure, not just the renewable projects themselves, but the pylons and the 400 kilovolt cable and all that good stuff, and what the implications for bills, for consumers' bills may be. Additionally then, basically asking the same questions about interconnection that we're asking Sony. What is the economics of that, and what would the implications for renewable generation in Northern Ireland would be? The suggestion being that it might undermine our renewable generation in Northern Ireland. Also maybe seeking sight of the report that they produced with the Consumer Council on consumer protection and the measures around price transparency. Additionally then, this is where members tell me, no, wise up, Clark, that's wrong. Does the committee wish to write to the ministers for the economy, communities and agriculture, environment and rural affairs, and just asking them what their plans are to work together to develop legislation in respective regulation of heat, hydrogen, home heating oil, consumer redress and community benefit? Because what the regulator said there was they can't regulate, can't do much about community benefit without regulation, and likewise about home heating oil, and also there was bits about consumer redress for enforcement, which we don't have in this jurisdiction, and they do have in GB. So asking those ministers what they're doing to work together to bring forward the relevant legislation, because it feels like economy are saying it's not them, it's not all them, it's others. Chairperson.
I'm content with that letter. I don't
Yeah.
know if anybody else, but I know Mike is looking in. Is it this point, Mike, or is it something else?
No, it's on the interconnector.
We'll just come back, if you don't mind, just in 2
Yeah,
seconds,
yeah,
just
yeah,
to deal
of
with this letter issue, just in terms of the ministers, Sinead.
I just think we probably, if we're writing that letter as well, it's just about the prioritisation of the most vulnerable in our society needs to be at the heart of it as well. The protection of the consumer at that level.
Agreed, Chair.
If everybody else is happy.
Mike?
Chair, I was taken with what John said about the interconnector and that we seem to be ahead of the Republic. What's the protocol, or is there a way in which we can ask the Government of Ireland or the North-South Ministerial Council for some sort of update on where they are?
We can write the air grid and ask them, because they would appear to be, they'd be looking after the, in the same way that Sony are looking after the.
So Air Grid would be the people.
I would have thought so. So we,
Write the air grid?
write the air grid and just ask them about progress in respect to the North-South Interconnector. Is that right?
Yeah. Members happy?
Or delays. I think it's all from the Louth side of the border. It's
For the
problematic.
2/3 aspect in the Republic of Ireland in particular, just in case we get abroad. I think that's the point that Mike was trying to.
Yeah.
Differentiate issue.
That's
The
agreed.
regulator reckons we're more advanced than you are. Can you give us an update?
Yeah, sure.
What are the issues?
Anything else, Clerk? Is that...
I think that was all.
Yeah. Okay. All right, members, we'll move on then to item number 8 on the agenda, which is the Department intends to make a statutory rule, the Further Education Student Support Amendment Regulations Northern Ireland 2024. The Clerk's covering note is at page 402, apologies. The proposed rule is subject to negative resolution procedure and would come into operation on the 1st of August 2024. The proposed rule matches similar provisions in England and other Northern Ireland provisions which apply to higher education students. Overseas students who wish to be eligible for home fee status generally must be resident and settled in the UK on the first day of the academic year for which they are paying fees. The proposed new rule will enhance eligibility such that students only need to be resident on the first day of their course. The proposed rule will also extend eligibility to certain other overseas student groups which are listed in the covering note. Members, do you have any questions in relation to this? I think it's a positive development.
Just to declare an
Declare
interest in
interest, yeah.
students, yeah. I have 2 students. So
If members are content, we will
Yeah.
advise the department we're content to proceed with the rule. Okay, everybody agreed?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Lovely.
Item number 9 is a briefing from RAISE, the Research and Information Service. Assembly research paper on AI, artificial intelligence, on page 410. Are members content to note the paper?
There. Sorry, just can I come in there? Just in relation to the paper, it indicates that, you know, the largest number of job losses are going to be Armagh City, Banbridge, Craigavon, etc. So there's a list of them. You know, I think we should write to the department and ask what preparations are they doing in order to support those council areas that may lose jobs as a result of AI. So.
Yeah. Members content with that? Yeah. Item number 10 on the agenda is correspondence. Members, if you refer to page 456, where you will find an index of the items of correspondence within the meeting pack. Item number 2 is at page 458. Members are asked to note correspondence in response to committee queries on changes to grant aid in 23-24 of £40 million. The departments have provided a table which shows a shortfall in spending in Invest NI matched by additional spending in Tourism NI accounted for £20 million. Also additional costs at further education colleges associated with staff salaries of £33 million. Are members content to note?
And
Item 3 is at page 463. Members are asked to note a response to committee queries in respect of the legislative consent motion for the Westminster Bill Economic Activities of Public Bodies Bill. The bill deals with procurement by some public bodies and is understood to possibly have implications for the discretion of executive ministers. The department advises that the executive is to consider this issue in the future. Is the committee content to note?
Note.
Yep. Item 4, page 466, members are asked to consider a departmental response in respect of the Pay Transparent Directive. The department has declined to answer the committee's question in respect of the consequences for businesses of the adoption of this directive. Is the committee content to write to the Department for Communities seeking an answer, considering we haven't got a response from the department yet? Everybody agreed? Yeah. Item 5, page 468. Members are asked to consider a response from the department. The department has not provided a copy of the Offshore Renewable Energy Action Plan. The Ofgem guidance document appears to advise that there is a buyout fund which operates in GB but not in Northern Ireland, and which generators contribute to if they are only able to meet a renewable energy obligation. The mutualisation process appears to be a sharing out arrangement for these funds under certain circumstances. Is the committee content to write to the utility regulator seeking clarity on the buyout fund and the mutualisation process? We could have asked them when they were here, but we'll write to them. Members agreed? Yep. Okay, item 6, page 536. Members are asked to note a response to committee queries providing information on R&D and innovation grant drawdowns, the role of Innovate NI, and reports on artificial intelligence. The response shows that Innovate UK has increased its support for Northern Ireland companies to around £45 million, driven by a small number of large projects, around half in Belfast. Information is also provided in Innovate NI's engagement with mostly advanced manufacturing, food and drink and ICT businesses. Are members content to note?
A note that half of it's in Belfast.
Yes,
so I note with concern.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Particularly on the point, given that the research report shows that the AI impact on other constituencies, particularly those in food and drink, which largely would relate to the query in relation to ABC, because obviously a lot of those jobs there are...
Incorporate that possibly in the letter as well. Yeah. Members happy? Yeah. Okay, item 7, page 690. Members are asked to note a call for evidence on developing biomethane production. The call for evidence includes stakeholder events and will last for 3 months. The department's planning scenario appears to be based on ultimately replacing perhaps around 20% of natural gas consumption with biomethane. Producers would require a subsidy of 6.5p per kilowatt hour versus a wholesale gas price of 2.5p. The likely main sources of fuel appear to be poultry litter. Economic viability would appear to depend on perhaps 20 AD plants and the sale of related products. Example, digestion, carbon dioxide and revenue generated from the renewable transport fuel obligation. Are members content to note that? Yeah. Item 8 is page 735. Members are asked to note the Department's capital spending report for April 2024. Members content to note? Item 9 at page 739. Members are asked to note a response to committee queries in respect of Ofgem's withdrawal as administrator of the non-domestic RHI scheme. Ofgem advises that it will delay withdrawal until April 2026, but that the transfer of functions and data will begin in 2025. Is the committee content to write to the department and ask it to set out the next steps for the non-domestic RHI scheme? Johnny?
Yes, Chair, I think that would be very important. I think we also have to ask for the department's assessment of where that leaves things in the interim, particularly around the court case and the need for an uplift in payment and where that stands in relation to business case. So there's a few questions and queries following on from our previous sessions that this may give some clarity to or may provide further confusion, but I think it would be important for us to get the clarity on that.
So we had a closed session.
Yep.
So I don't want now an open session to be.
Yep.
But there is an issue in terms of timing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I think it's important we do write. Sorry, Clerk, do you want to?
No, it's just what they're indicating is that they're going to stick on till 2026.
30th of April 2026.
Yes, 2 years.
Yeah.
Will it be? Is that enough? It's not.
So I think it is important we do write to the department and get clarity.
Confusion, clarity.
Yes. Well, it is, and certainly the briefing. Obviously, there's a change since what we heard from in closed session. Absolutely.
So this is helpful in terms of clarifying.
Yeah.
But the prospect of a hiatus remains, and we
absolutely
need to clarify.
Okay, members, so you're happy. Do you want to summarise, Clerk, as to what we're actually asking of the department?
Right, we're writing to the department just asking it to set out the next steps for non-domestic RHI, but also I think we'd already asked, and we'll ask again about where the business case is, what about the revised tariff, and what their assessment is of that information from Ofgem.
I think the point was, does this change the deliberations in relation to the business case? Because I think that's the point. Does this give more clarity to allow decisions to be made in that regard?
Okay, members happy we send that? Yeah, okay. Item 10 is at page 743. Members are asked to note a copy of correspondence from a concerned individual campaigning for post-19 SEN provision. Is the committee content to write to the department seeking information on their policy position? Members agreed?
Yep.
Yeah. Item 11, page 746. Members are asked to note correspondence from the Office of the Northern Ireland Executive in Brussels, setting out the Brussels activity report from January to March 2024. The committee content to note? Yeah. Item 12, page 777. Members are asked to note a copy of further correspondence in respect of EU regulations relating to the energy labelling of tumble dryers. Is the committee content to note? Yeah. Item 13 is at page 779. Members are asked to note a copy of the correspondence in respect of EU regulations relating to critical raw materials. Is the committee content to write to the department seeking its views on the economic impact of EU regulations relating to critical raw materials?
Yep.
Members content. Item 14 is at page 781. Members are asked to note correspondence from the Royal Society of Ulster Architects making a request to brief the committee on the consequences of the anticipated defective premises bill. Is the committee content to refer this to the Committee for Communities, given obviously their role and remit? Yep. And item 15 is at page 784. Members are asked to note correspondence from Pivotal asking to brief the committee on its report on economic activity. As other briefings on this are been brought forward from the Ulster University Economic Policy Unit, are members minded to accept or decline this, given we've similar briefings coming forward?
I think Pivotal is very good. It's very independent.
I've no issue. I've no great difficulty, but it seemed to me the report was very similar to the Ray's report.
I think that's the difficulty. Obviously, we have quite. Is it something that we could maybe come back to at a later date in terms of?
No. Could you come back? Data? No. What?
No, I suspect not. I think maybe members. I think members will be mindful at this stage.
I think a point of note, we had a good briefing. I believe so. Yeah. I think given the committee's workload, it might be difficult just to fit in everything that we need.
Well, I think we'll discuss the forward work programme now shortly, but I think maybe even at this initial stage, if they keep us updated in terms of written briefings, I think would be important. But we do have, as I say, the Ulster University Economic Policy Unit. All right, members, who contend? Yeah. Yes.
So, Chair, could we ask Grays to compare the Pivotal report to what they briefed us on? Because I do think it's
sure. No, absolutely. No, we don't have this
huge overlap. I don't think they're in any significant disagreement.
No. Nor do we want to disregard anybody. It's just we're trying to manage time so that, can we ask Grays for that?
Yep, we'll do, Chairperson.
Members, are there any queries in respect of any items of the correspondence? No. Content. Okay. Item 11, forward work programme. Members, if you turn to page 806, Clerk, do you want to maybe outline? There's been a few additional things that have come in, changes, etc.
Yes, Chairperson. So, as members may be aware, I understand there's to be a budget debate on the 28th of May. So we had scheduled the department for the 5th of June, so that doesn't really work. So they've agreed to come on the 22nd of May, so it's an additional briefing, so we'll have to start a bit earlier that day. They haven't quite completed all of their processes, but they're willing to come along and tell us as much as they can, so that would then inform members' contribution to the budget debate, which has been brought by the executive on the 28th of May. Well, members can take a read on that. If they are satisfied with what they hear, that's grand. If not, then the department have agreed that they would come again on the 5th of June and talk about their business plans when everything's done and dusted. So, but sure, you can take a read on that on the 22nd of May, if that's okay.
It is important, obviously, that the department bring as much detail as they can to that as well.
Yeah, I understand, speaking to the other clerks, that other departments are in the same. So this was a very odd. It was a very odd budget setting arrangement, very different from previous years. Usually, when they get this stage of the game, the department knows everything, but the allocations, I think, were made fairly recently, and they've been going through the process of actually making those allocations, screening them, etc. Additionally, then, Chairperson, I've been in contact with the Ulster University Economic Policy Centre. They've produced quite a lot of papers on economic inactivity, labour inclusion, tourism, and hybrid working. So our committee content for me to schedule those in. I'm also in contact with QUB and the Nevin Research Institute, the Economic Research Institute. So we'll try and slide these ones in. So I've noticed that's a thing that's maybe a little bit missing, is the economic policy piece. So members are content for me to do that.
Members content?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Additionally, Chairperson, as you can see from there, I'm trying to secure Dr. Lisa Wilson to come and talk to us about good jobs. But also, as you instructed me last week, we're trying to track down the other critical friends and see if they will come along and brief the committee in due course. If members are content with that. Also, Chair, am I misinterpreting this, but do I sense from members that they maybe would like somebody to come along and talk to them about artificial intelligence and all that?
So, absolutely.
Yeah, I think it is very
useful. Yeah.
So I'll try and get you as an expert, such human expert on artificial intelligence.
We'll talk to the bot.
But if you've ever seen a presentation done by an artificial intelligence, I have, and they're quite good. So there were
perhaps that's something that you can work on to bring forward.
Yeah. We were trying to do this a film for members all about the budget process when I was finance clerk, and so I did this script, and communications gave it to an AI, and it did a presentation. And it wasn't bad. It really wasn't bad. Anyway, Chairperson, that is the forward work programme.
It's great. Are members content then that we schedule those and prepare for those in the coming weeks? Yeah, content. Okay. Members, item 12, any other business that anybody would like to raise or they would like to see on a future meeting agenda? Item 13 is the date, time and place of next meeting. You'll be glad to hear that Philip Brett is due to be back on Wednesday the 15th of May next week at 10 a.m. here in room 30 in Parliament Buildings.
Committee Room 30, sound. Committee Room 30, sound.